In this lesson, we'll learn about object attributes and how we can use them to control the look of the vector objects that we create. Alright, so now that we're familiar and up to speed with anchor points and control handles, let's talk about what really makes our vector shapes look the way they do. If you remember early on in this course, I mentioned that inherently vector shapes are really invisible. What makes them apparent to us, what makes us able to see them, are attributes that we add. So let's talk about three basic types of attributes. The first two are pretty apparent in everything you see here on my artboard. This is the Lesson 6 Begin file if you want to open it up and follow along. We'll come in and zoom in here on this logo first, and the first two attributes that I want to discuss with you are both strokes and fills. Now, basically, if we come in here and use our selection tool and select this little surfer dude over here. So we'll select him. This particular object has a fill attribute applied to it. And I can tell by looking at the object because it's a solid light blue color. Now, if we were to come over here and compare this to maybe this P next to him, this P also has a color inside the path, but it also has a color that borders the path as well. So this object has both a fill color and a stroke color applied to it. It's got attributes applied to both the fill and the stroke of this path. So if we come over here, you can actually see once I've got that piece selected, over here at the bottom of our tool panel, you'll notice here that we have this solid square, which is representing of our fill color, and then we have this hollow square that represents our stroke. So you can see here we can actually come in and switch those places if we wanted to, simply by clicking on this little arrow button right here, and that'll alternate the two, just like so. Let me go ahead and switch those back. Now, the default color scheme in Illustrator is to have a white fill with a black stroke around it. And we can always revert back to that simply by clicking on this button right here. We could also, let me just undo that, we could also hit the D key on our keyboard, which also sets the color scheme back to default. Now, we can not only see the stroke and the fill attributes that have been applied to a selected shape over here in the tool panel, we can also see up here in our control panel. We can see right here we have, again, our solid square, and we have our hollow square, our square with a little shape punched out of it here. And we can actually click on the little drop down next to each one of these, and what you'll see up here is a sort of a shortcut to one of the panels that live over here on the right in Illustrator's panel dock. This is called the swatch panel, and you'll see here a number of different colors that are saved as swatches inside this panel. Now, we can actually access the color panel from these drop downs as well. If we were to hold down the shift key and click on that arrow, you'll see that we access the color panel instead. So that's how you can actually see both if an attribute has been applied as well as changing the color of that attribute. Now, there's one central place where we can come inside of Illustrator to really sort of manage all of our object attributes. And it's right over here. It's this little panel right over here in the panel dock. It's called the Appearance panel, and I'm just simply going to click and drag that out so that we can look at it in its full form. Now, if we come over here to this Appearance panel, and let me just go ahead and click on that arrow to collapse this here. Let's kind of take a glimpse at the information this Appearance panel is presenting us with. It's telling us up here what type of object we have selected, being, in this case, a compound path. Now, compound paths are really beyond the scope of this course. We do have other courses in our library that go into quite a bit of depth over what exactly is a compound path and how do you use them. We'll go ahead and talk about some next steps for you towards the end of this course. But if we look here in the Appearance panel, you'll see we have both a stroke attribute and a fill attribute. Now, we have the overall object opacity here as well. So each one of these little orange words in this case, you see I can mouse over those and I can click on those. And those are going to access one of the panels that Illustrator offers in the panel dock. In this case, this is the stroke panel. It's actually the same as this panel right over here. Now, the stroke panel is where we can actually control the stroke attribute that's been applied to an object. So you can see here we have things like the stroke weight. You can see in this case it's 0.762 points is the weight or the thickness. We can click that up and down just like so. Or we can come in here and use this drop down to select one of these numbers here. There is a cap, a corner, and an align stroke option here. Now we're not going to have time to go through each and every different setting for each of these object attributes. So in this case, let me just go ahead and we'll just go ahead and undo back a few steps. There we go. So you can see the stroke and all of its settings can be changed right here from the appearance panel. So we can actually twirl this little arrow and you can see that we can control the opacity of just the stroke independent from the opacity of the fill. And again, if we click on that opacity link there, it's going to actually take you over here to the transparency panel here inside of Illustrator. So if I click on that, you'll see a lot of settings that are related to the opacity of just the stroke in this case. So you can also, let's see here, let's go and twirl down the fill color. Again, control the opacity of just the fill color right here from the appearance panel. We can click on that swatch and we can access the swatches panel right here, just like we could up here in the control panel. And then lastly, we can also click on opacity for the entire selected object and control that right here. So the appearance panel is a really great place to sort of manage the attributes that you have assigned to an object. We could even come in and click on these little eyeballs to the left of each of these attributes, and we can hide them temporarily. We can maintain all the settings that we've configured, but if we wanted to see this P without the stroke, we could come in and hide that there. So let's go ahead and turn that back on for right now. All right, great. So there's one last type of attribute that I wanted to show you, and we're not going to go into a lot of detail on this type of attribute because it's really kind of secondary. Let's go ahead and just move over to maybe my second example over here. This is another logo for Motelevision, and we'll just zoom in on that, and maybe let's use our selection tool to click on one of these letters here. And actually, let me go ahead and all these orange letters, I'm going to hold down the Shift key so I can select all of them here. Now, you'll see here that the appearance panel is telling me I have mixed objects selected. That's because the gradient differs just slightly on each one of these objects. But let's go ahead and come down here to the bottom of our appearance panel and click on this little FX button. So if we click on this, these are effects that we can apply to our objects inside of Illustrator. Now, an effect is kind of a different type of attribute because each one of these is going to be a little different depending on the type of effect that you want. So these are Illustrator native effects up here above this perforated line. And if you're a Photoshop user below this perforation, you may find some of these effects down here to be very similar because they're pretty much the exact same ones you would find inside of Photoshop. So let's go ahead and come over here and jump to Stylize. And I'm going to choose this drop shadow option right here. Now this is Stylize under Illustrator effects. So let's choose drop shadow. And we'll be presented with our little drop shadow settings dialog here. Now, I'm just going to take the defaults here because we could spend a lot of time configuring that, but let's just go ahead and click on OK. And I want to show you what happens here. So you can see here that a drop shadow option has been added to the appearance panel for each one of these selected objects. So if I were to click away and maybe just select just this object right here, now we not only have a stroke attribute and a fill attribute. By the way, this little red line right here indicates that there's no stroke color applied to this particular path. So we have both those two attributes here, but we also have an effects attribute. You can see the FX right over here, and you can see that it is a drop shadow. So we can come over here and we can hide that drop shadow just like we can with a stroke or a fill. Or we could come in and modify the settings for that drop shadow, again by clicking on the orange text that says drop shadow. And if we do, it's going to bring us right back over here to our drop shadow settings dialog where we could come in and maybe adjust some of these settings some. just like so. And maybe we can rein that drop shadow back in just a little bit here. So as you can see, there's really three main types of attributes that can be applied to an object here inside of Adobe Illustrator. We have a fill, we have a stroke, and we have effects. And there are also a lot of different places where we can control these attributes. Now, my recommendation for you is to get used to using this appearance panel, because this is just a great central location to come in and manage the attributes applied to your objects. All right, so there's a couple different logos in this file. If you'd like to, feel free and play with the different objects that make up these logos, adjusting their attributes, maybe changing them around just a little bit. Once you've kind of got used to this workflow, feel free to go ahead and move on to the next lesson. And we're going to begin learning about a few ways that we can create vector shapes here inside of Illustrator.